So we are about to start a couple of minutes past 2. So I've already told you that maybe this room is a bit oversized for our session. So I do hope that this will not prevent us from actually supporting and spur the dialogue. I am Gina Wollinger. I am a professor for criminology at the University for Police and Public Administration in the city of Cologne, and I'm really happy to be here and moderate this panel. This panel that includes the discussion on the expert document pertaining to this year's Congress, and we talked about in the plenary session. So when we started off dealing with those items, we talked about how we can manage crises in a good way, and crises are actually entailed in these modern structures. So Olaf Scholz is not the first chancellor who was defined as a crisis chancellor. So, however, we have seen that they do tend to happen more and more often. And then I started to identify some possible writers and contributors to this document from a number of perspectives, and there are quite a few questions that could be asked at a societal level. How do we go about managing such a situation? How can we support the different individuals composing this society, and then the different theoretical aspects as well, so the philosophy of it and the law and legal related aspects. So therefore, I am really happy that we actually managed to gather those 11 contributions that we included in the scientific publication to this Congress that you can also find online. So I am very happy actually to have 3 of those contributors here with us today. So to show us the main perspectives that will be the subject matter of today's dialogue. So we'll start off with Professor Rita Haverkamp, working for the University of Tübingen. And she also works in the Center Against Extremisms, amongst other things. A very warm welcome. Then we have Professor Donya Gilan. She is also an expert. She is part of the Leibniz-Institut for Resilience Studies in the city of Mainz. So she deals with the different factors pertaining to mental health and how we can adapt to changing times, in particular in a moment of crisis at a global level. Then we also have Bo Tackenberg, professor at the Mountain University Wuppertal. So him also dealing with different resilience pertaining aspects at a societal level. Thank you very much for being here. I am very happy to shed some light onto those issues together today. So I would like to start off with the kick-off items that are the main messages of this document. However, I am happy to be able to go over them again with you. So there are some mics that you can ask for. Please do not be shy. And do take part actively in this discussion so that you can share any comments or questions that you might have. Of course, as a piece of advice, this panel will be recorded and is actually translated into English, and it will be uploaded onto our channels, including our YouTube channel. So, Professor Haverkamp, so this, well, we need to accept that crises will come up time and again. So this is a bit disappointing. Obviously, we're here to talk about prevention, so we try to actually avoid such a thing. How do we go about it? Yeah, so I would like to kick off with a well-known sentence. Before a crisis is actually after the crisis, and I would like to add throughout a crisis. So we are in a sort of crisis mode. And this is actually a typical feature of the 21st century. So we have a number of crises that overlap, that are intertwined with one another. So they do require a permanent crisis management. And this is actually the challenge for the communities and the municipalities over the next few years. So what do we mean when we say crisis? So the feature thereof is that they are limited over time and from a geographical viewpoint. Over time, what do I mean? So they begin somehow, somewhen, and then how long will they last? Where are they anchored? Maybe at a global level. Think about the climate crisis, and then they are manifested in a number of ways and in a specific area. So, and then you also have a waterfall effect, if you will, when thinking about the war in Ukraine. But I would like to use another metaphor, a rhizoma. So this is a metaphor that was used by a French philosopher. So if you have a hobby and you like gardening, then if you like to mix plants, then you will know what a rhizoma is. So this is something pertaining to a number of touch points of the different roots of a plant, so not located specific in one point only. And that is exactly what I want to convey. So it's intertwining crises like the roots of a tree. So we have the Ukraine energy crisis, climate crisis, and so on and so forth, food crises. So this creates a type of multiple crises that the communities need to actually manage, and that is where prevention comes into play. So, Professor Gilan, you said that all those aspects have to do with the societal resilience aspects. So let's stick to the individual resilience first, which is part thereof. So what do you mean by that? What do we need to be resilient? So first of all, I would like to answer by quoting flexibility. Flexibility is of paramount importance to actually adapt to new situations. So the resilience mechanisms that are flexible and agile, so that we can change our attitude and the way we react to stress contexts and situations. So this determines a certain degree of resilience. So it has a number of facets, for example, strategies, skills, and then you have the personal skills that are connected to every single individual. For example, the fact that we perceive our own worth connected, of course, to the social context. So there is an aspect of social resilience, so the network in which we act. This is a sort of social support that we perceive at times of crisis. And then there are structural factors that may also represent a limit to such resilience. So in terms of participation to social and socioeconomic aspects, so we have touched upon that time and again. So there might be groups that are left out. So there might be many barriers to such access into society. So in psychology, we define that as a restructuring of our behaviors. So let's say, not to be too theoretical, we should try and stay healthy and perceive resilience in terms of our own environment, so the family members around us, so that we can take into account multidimensional processes. So actually, let's stick to the societal level. We've talked about how we can manage those times at best with the different structures. So for example, the different processes of our everyday life that should be left untouched, so to speak. So could you further comment on that? So do we tend to get more social or anti-social at a level? Well, the social adaptation that we've talked about can actually be manifested in a number of different ways, also opposite ways. So we also have anti-social behaviors. So I believe that the form of such behaviors depends on a number of factors. For example, the type of event that we're talking about, but also the duration thereof, depending on the different phases that unfold. So for example, in the past, let's think about the 50s and the 60s. So we had a very accepting society, for example, that then developed into a more racist type of behavior. So when we talk about crises or catastrophes, they're always connected to a certain place and time, as we said. So in the beginning, we start engaging ourselves, and then things change and we let go a bit. So we have seen that with the coronavirus pandemic. So over time, we saw such a development. And talking about the pandemic, we have also observed antisocial behaviors. So like it's like running in a wheel, like a hamster. So anyway, we can say that right at the beginning of a crisis and the catastrophe, the potential is there and it's evident. So to explain that a little bit better, I don't think that crises or catastrophes are the reason why people behave in a certain way. They're the context. So the different types of events do have an impact, but there are other reasons why that we touched upon before. So when we talk about protection factors, as you said, there is a sort of social resilience that creates a more solid structure around us. So when we talk about prevention, so in your article, for example, we talk about the situation of children, so your childhood, and then again, reorienting towards prevention. What would you state in this case in society? What can empower us more from this viewpoint? How can we put that into practice in a practical viewpoint? So I believe that the most important viewpoint is our attitude. So maybe a sort of paradigmatic change, if you will, that can happen in school, at a kindergarten. You can learn that in a ludic way as well. So other perspectives and of about how you can go about different difficult situations. So from this catastrophization, this can help us actually to keep afloat, especially in a situation which is of such great difficulty. So stay active from this viewpoint to go over such issues, and then, as I said, stay active, finding solutions. You can also do that in schools at an experimental level, for example, without sticking to classes in which professors only speak, but try and make it more interactive. So I believe that those core future skills such as openness to diversity can be further spurred. So in a way we can create some sort of collective behavior. So we need to take that into account in such stressful situations, and this is interconnected with your private life, but then once again social skills rely upon this, and so actually being motivated to do so, and then changing your perspective, and that happens when we support dialogue and we actually speak to one another. So this needs to be present at all level in society, in our society overall, in schools, so that we can stay active, stay engaged, and support our health care skills. So we're moving on to a more political level, which is obviously a pillar of our institutions. So we talked about mental health. And in this panel, you've had the chance to read the document that we said that was published. So in terms of crisis prevention, how shall we include mental health and all its pertaining aspects, which are multiple and differentiated? So can we include that in a prevention context? And so shall we do that, or shall we transfer all those aspects to a community level as well? So in your community, we should be active, and we should actually get the chance to see that this generates a certain impact. We touched upon the topic of social capital. Can we be empowered more? And what is actually the responsibility of the different communities when we talk about such an aspect, social capital, as we said? How can we breathe life into this? So first of all, why social capital? Why is this a resilience resource of paramount importance? So from our perspective, so I support all those skills in the when considering the capacity of handling the situation at a common level in the communities. So this is a pro-social attitude. And crises and catastrophes are situations in which our sticking together is actually put to the test. So then that is when social capital actually plays a role. When individuals are integrated into such a system, into such a network, then we can see the value of all of this. So for example, we feel like we have to engage, or we are liable in certain contexts, so we need to help in a context of crisis. And so this is a topic which is also quite often left aside when thinking about such an event management strategy. So then we talked about the communities, not only the communities, but also organization pertaining to the different neighborhoods and the different levels at which individuals can be active together. So we need to create safe spaces in which we can connect to one another, we can interact, finding common interests to actually engage ourselves and then act, supporting our own needs. So it's a social space for the sake of a social space, if you will. So this is obviously difficult to find a one-stop shop and answer. So there are, I would say that the most important thing is that we need to create situations in which we can come across one another, we can interact with one another, and create tolerance so that we can share and put into practice our own ideas, our own beliefs and values, and this would be my approach. So I believe that there are small interventions that might not look like they pertaining in such a context in the Prevention Congress, but they are connected to social integration and identity so that we can further support in a way. And then I would like to go back to one point, so legitimacy. So can we actually connect that to state actions? So obviously we need to go back to the to what happened over the pandemic. So is this legitimate at all? So at times of crisis, maybe they could have done more at a representative level. Well, actually, this is a complex question because we need to actually understand what type of idea lies at the base of legitimacy. So it is utilized in a number of contexts, political studies, for example, however, but also in legal studies, in sociology. So now I would like to shed some light onto this idea from this political perspective, so we can talk about conviction, for example, or the fact that we ask for more legitimacy. So we need to concentrate on the first factor. So citizens need to be convinced of such aspects. So that is to say that the different actors in the political world need to be perceived as legitimate stakeholders. And that is when their actions are then understood and legitimized, as we said. So, and this is connected to another aspect of legitimacy. That is to say, the legitimation, if you will, oriented and connotated in a more legal way. So, how can I put it? A citizen could actually perceive an action as legitimate when this is displayed, for example, by a police officer. So, for example, when we talk about masks, we need to go back once again to the examples of the pandemic. So the different perception of legitimate actions and legitimate indications when we need or need not wear a mask. So legitimization, if you will, vis-a-vis being legitimate. So I have just shown you a practical example. It is important for the population to actually understand and accept the actions that are put into place in such contexts that might be highly problematic, especially when they are dragged on over time, as you said before. So in particular, throughout the pandemic, this was actually something that we saw. So the acceptance level of the different actions put into place decreased. And this is actually the main challenge that we need to face throughout those crises in the long run. So in such a pluralistic and heterogeneous society in which we live, fostering therefore possible conflicts, since there are quite a few society groups, this means that not everybody will be convinced of the positivity of such actions put into place. And how do we go about that? So we talked about accepting all those actions from a psychological viewpoint. So I believe that communication is key in this context. And then we have already heard and about that, and we've already written about that, and that is what actually was lacking right at the beginning of the crisis, because there is also an emotional part of it that was not fully taken into account, that was not easy when conveying relevant pieces of information. But that is an aspect of our being human, and that can help us face and manage such situations. In particular, this is relevant for risky groups or risk-related groups. So communicating in an emotional way, and then creating trust, fostering trust through the media, through communication. So trust at an institutional level, this is one of the most important factors when we talk about collective resilience. And we can see that over time, over our history. So whenever people got together, we could observe some expectations, for example. So we need to come up with a sort of strategy to avoid such uncertainties. So we saw that was kind of an oracle. For example, if we think about the past, and if we think about a more religious aspect of all of this, so the connection between the expectations of the population itself and the fact that that our society becomes and has become more and more complex. So the both sides need to be taken into account from a political viewpoint as well to create new trust. And I believe that this is for both groups important. Obviously, we're talking about heterogeneous groups, but to simplify this, we could define them as such. And so how can we reinforce this? We've already talked about that altogether. So the fact that we can come together at a community/municipality level, so participation, something that needs to be cultivated and fostered so that individuals can actually contribute directly to the different actions that are created and put into practice, so that it can actually abide by certain rules. And then another aspect which is important are the different symptoms of this feeling exhausted after being actually strongly motivated in the beginning. So there's pro-social behaviors that we saw and that you touched upon. So for we have invested in this a lot, and then the situation changed completely, and this has an impact. So this would be the classical prevention paradox, if you will, that was to be seen throughout the pandemic. And this was a crucial aspect of the climate crisis as well. What types of motivation are there to see? Because the results are not immediately clear, maybe. then we talked about resilience in a number of contexts, climate, and we could put that into practice when we talk about mental health. And at a mediatic level, we can find positive role models that can show us what type of strategy we can actually utilize. Can we learn from one another? And we can learn how people that we refer to and look up to actually went about finding a solution of their own. So they are kind of big examples of resilience, the system relevant actors, for example, and examples that were portrayed in the media to actually empower everybody a bit more.
So if you have role models, you can also strengthen the emotional side. And well, this is very important. And especially people who are on the front line during the crisis, especially during a healthcare pandemic. Well, they were active and they can remove a little bit of fear from those who may not have such a control over the situation. And this can have a positive effect on other people who are usually fearful. Yes, of course. And well, self-efficacy is also important because if you act and if you are effective on yourself, this is also motivating. And this is quite interesting because there's a report by Professor Zick, who unfortunately could not attend this meeting, and he said that crises are usually the moment when biases or radical positions acquire a much more important role. So on the one hand, we have this problem. On the other hand, there are people who act in a pro-social So the question is how to cope with such a situation. So the question is, do we have to wait for a catastrophe for having a more pro-social approach? Because so I can go to my neighbor and see what I can do for her, for him, because I have specific skills, or how to cope. Well, can this be an explanation between well, of this dichotomy between solidarity on the one hand and the opposite attitude on the other? It could be an explanation. It's not the only possible explanation, of course. Well, I think it's a time-related factor. So both in terms of crisis and during catastrophes, well, the longer the event and the more time you need to manage this event, you may change your attitude and you may move from a pro-social to an anti-social attitude. There are reports saying that pro-social behaviors are usually to be seen in the very beginning and at the beginning of a catastrophe. So when you suffer a damage, you act immediately and you intervene. But in terms of catastrophes, well, the longer you need to cope with that catastrophe, the more antisocial you become. And when confronted with a catastrophe, you see that there are many people involved who are ready to help, but as time goes by, people providing aid and support stay simply too long on the front line because they do not only provide help but also food and another type of support. So I wouldn't rather distinguish the situation between a crisis and a catastrophe. I would rather focus on the time-related issue. And this is also very important for crisis prevention. There are different stages of a crisis that are important, and this is what you also wrote in your report. So what timing would you consider as relevant in crisis? There are three stages in a crisis. We have the before the pre-crisis, the acute phases, so the emergency, the catastrophe stage, and the post-crisis phase. In the pre-crisis phase, you have to get ready for what is going to happen, although you don't know exactly what is going to happen. And so the idea is how to develop scripts or concepts for something that you do not know exactly how to cope with. And this is the decisive point. As we saw during the COVID pandemic crisis, we then have an acute phase that can be long or short, and afterwards, well, you may have also different waves, and afterwards, the post-crisis stage starts. So the crisis is declared as over, and so the first question we should ask ourselves is, what do we exactly mean by crisis? Do we have to consider a crisis also in the pre-crisis phase? Do we have to raise the attention, and do we have to set the stage so that communication is properly perceived, and so that all people realize that a crisis has broken out? So the causes of a crisis are very important. In the COVID crisis, we could very well observe how the majority of the population, especially in the beginning, were divided into two parts. Well, 2/3 of the population were convinced about the existence of a crisis. They fulfilled the regulations and they stick to the measures. And afterwards, and little by little, the alternative thinkers started to emerge, providing alternatives. And here we see the social aspect related to the crisis. As soon as a crisis is over, then we have a structure and organization that play a role. In our federalistic system, we have regions and municipalities. Municipalities have to have the major burden because they are the local authorities, and so they have to manage the crisis, the emergencies, the catastrophes with their local bodies. The question in that case is first and foremost, who is impacted by the crisis, who is affected by the crisis. If you consider the municipal texture, you see that there are fire brigades, the police, who are the most important bodies. In large cities, there are task forces, for example, the fire brigades, but also the police forces have played the most important role. But if you consider the individual municipalities with their different bodies, well, the question is, are these bodies, are these local municipal bodies, or are they rather regional bodies and authorities which work together in times of crisis? Because during the COVID crisis, many authorities were surprisingly hit by the crisis, by the pandemic, and so they underwent a series of crises in order to overcome the emergencies. And only afterwards, the post-crisis stage starts. And in that phase, you have to understand what the status quo of the municipalities is and what lessons they can draw from the crisis management affecting the entire municipality. And it shouldn't be necessarily a crisis, a pandemic. It could also be something else. In the post-crisis period, we have a lot of questions and tasks that we have to tackle, especially at a municipal level. What can we say for the future? I would say organizations should reflect within themselves about how this crisis was dealt with. But as I said previously, these phases often overlap, and now we have also a refugee crisis, a crisis within a crisis, and now, for example, we have to do with a lot of refugees and migrants, and there too we saw in the different organizations and communities, different organizations and different roles which are responsible for specific individual aspects. In a municipality, we have usually an institution which is responsible for accommodating the refugees, and another institution which is in charge of the social aspect. We also have different financial resources. So the question is, how do they cooperate? How can we work together so that we can overcome the gaps between the different levels. And municipalities have learned in the past few years how to cooperate between and among the different levels, but also within their own model. Right, so in this, in your reports, you focus on the population protection, which is very important. So we heard how important it is to have networks, to have cooperation, a good distribution of tasks, and role plans. This is certainly important. But by the way, I'd like to invite you to contribute to this conversation. There is a microphone in the middle, so you can also contribute if you want, if you have had particular experiences or any other remarks. Is the microphone working? My name is Schubert from the region Brandenburg. So, well, I'm very happy to hear that resilience promotion is very important, especially among children and young people who are usually the losers, especially during the COVID pandemic. And you said, well, very little has changed because the idea was to set up such an institution to promote the resilience among children and young people. So what are the obstacles that you were confronted with, and what are the chances that we can learn? So we need democratic resilience, we have to focus on prevention, and well, there are a lot of suggestions and follow-up works which have identified the real problems in schools, in the education ministry, but well, teachers also need a lot of training and continuous education. What can we do in this respect in order to foster resilience promotion among children and young people? Well, the question is for you all. Well, you children and young people play a very important role for the next for the future generation? Well, first of all, it's a political issue. It's a question of investing, and politicians have to make decisions also in terms of investments. But as far as resilience promotion among children, well, there must be room for experimentation in kindergartens and schools. There must be projects both within and outside the school contexts. For example, children may liaise with, for example, people from other cultures. Well, every time adaptation is needed, resilience is promoted. And then as for adults, resilience can be promoted while raising up the children. So the idea is to guide children, of course, but children have also to be independent in coping with frustration, with boredom. The idea is to leave children cope with their own negative emotions, because in so doing, they will become much better adults in terms of regulating their emotions and feelings, and this could lead to a problem-solving approach. Acceptance, so the idea of accepting situations that cannot be changed, and other situations that can lead to a positive mood. All these situations aim at being able to positively regulate one's own emotions, and on the other hand, the idea is to control positive emotions, and so that positive thinking is generated, and in so doing, people become also much more active instead of being negative or being marginalized. These are the approaches, and this is also what is being supported by researchers, and I can recommend some books in this respect. The socially disadvantaged children and young teenagers are to be highlighted. Well, for particular reasons, because, well, they need a lot of resources, especially because socially disadvantaged children and young people suffered even more during the COVID pandemic. So the requirement has become higher. There are a lot of evidence-based programs and concepts that are implemented. However, at a regional level, if we want to promote the resilience of children, there are long-established programs, and these programs receive usually the funds and the personnel resources they need. But this is not usually the case for socially disadvantaged children. In this respect, we see that municipalities go different ways. The city of Augsburg, for example, has an evidence-based program. Communities That Care is the name of this program, and this is a program which focuses on the well-being of children and teenagers in cities with very pragmatic and empirical methods. So we heard the word resources twice. Well, there's a lot of know-how. What does resilience promotion means? What does criminal prevention needs for proper development of children and young people, because we know what we can do in order to strengthen these people, but what we are missing are programs. I mean, there are a lot of programs that are missing. So what do we need now if we go back to the question? This Well, first of all, we need to allocate the money, because we cannot pretend from teachers to do everything, because they already have a lot of problems in terms of classrooms that are becoming bigger and bigger. So first of all, we need the resources so that programs can be implemented. But as you heard from by Ms. Gilan, well, resilience promotion requires that we set the stage for resilience promotion from the very beginning, from childhood, so that they can become stronger when they grow up. Again, if you have further questions or insights to share, have you had particular experiences, well, during the COVID pandemic with children, for example? Well, my perception is that little is done among children and young people, well, especially because they are rather neglected compared to industrial companies, for example. But this is my personal opinion. Again, if you have any questions, please go to the microphone. Now, in the meantime, let me focus on the word participation. You have already hinted at this concept in your previous remarks. And going back to the legitimacy and to acceptance, Ms. Haverkamp, do we have more room for state measures in order to increase the acceptance by the citizens, or have we run out of resources? And do we need a break after the COVID pandemic? So how can we further strengthen the participation, and how relevant is legitimacy? Well, on the one hand, participation is very important when it comes to legitimacy. But the question is, up to which extent should we have participation? Because there are many ways to participate in the community life and at a municipal level. And the question, however, is who is ready to be involved, to become engaged? Because on the one hand, people tend to serve their own interests. And then the question is, how can we further develop the participation tools that we have? For example, can we increase participation in our pluralist society, especially when we have different opinions about how to solve the problems in a city, or how to come to a shared solution. If we take the example of parking spaces, we have a high degree of polarization, which is also related to the climate change. So again, we have had long crisis which well, doesn't show its full effects. And so the certain municipality will not solve that problem by removing parking spaces, because we do not see the tangible effects of that measure. And so in municipalities, we have conflicts, and so who is ready to become engaged, and who can make sure that the requirements of the population are fulfilled. Citizens tend to be skeptical vis-à-vis changes, and well, the very word crisis implies that transformation processes have to be put in place, but people are reluctant towards new things. And we see, however, that measures that were rejected in the beginning by the population become then well accepted in a couple of years. The question is whether municipalities can make some tests. During the COVID pandemic, for example, we tested specific bike lanes, for example, in cities. And well, in the beginning, the general opinion was that this measure failed, and they wanted to go back to the previous method, but then different ideas were developed. However, we can see that when citizens cooperate with police forces, and when such communication happens at on a level playing ground, we see that the result of the negotiation process is not very important. What is important is that the procedure is carried out in a fair way, so that citizens feel they are legitimate to contribute, and then they support the police.
So I would like to say something about participation. I believe that the problem has to do with how we go about participation, not the fact that we're not there, that there is nobody taking part, but rather how we go about it. So we see a crisis, of course, but I believe that this is more evident in a catastrophic situation. So for example, how many people we manage to help out, but in a big crisis such as those ones, how do we go about it in a professional way? How do we imply also volunteers? So when we talk about such participation at a civil society level, how can we manage it best? So how we support that in the long run? So we have classical models, for example, is not attractive at all for many people. So there are people who would like to engage themselves, but they're not flexible enough, or the situation is not actually flexible enough to actually do that in the current structure. So we need to find different models in which people can actually get active even though they're not that flexible. So I believe that this is not an issue in terms of people not being willing to help out, but rather how we go about it. So I believe that there is also another aspect, so many different concrete perspectives, maybe volunteers that can be ready to help out. So I'm thinking about the topic of actually protecting the different groups, as we said before. So on the other hand, you've just touched upon the fact that there are systems in place, if I've understood correctly what you meant. So at a professional level, there must be actors that nevertheless should be able to actually manage such situations in a more flexible way? Yes and no. So I believe that there are some spots that are still gray areas from a legal viewpoint as well when we want to actually include the civil society. And I believe that we have managed to focus more on the question of participation, so an organization of such participation. There are skeptical perspectives expressed by professionals when we talk about volunteers. So of course, they have trained for years and years to be active in a certain context, and then it's only obvious for them to be a bit skeptical when somebody just shows up and decides to help. So that has also to do with the mental health side of things. So if they can face such a situation from a psychological viewpoint, if they can handle it and take upon them to actually help out. So this is actually a psychosocial aspect in terms of support to be offered. So I believe that there is, however, some sort of skeptical perspective that was expressed. Yes, are there any questions about the topic? So actually, in the plenary session, we touched upon another topic, that is to say, well, maybe we could have different ideas from this viewpoint. So during the pandemic, we had quite a few issues in terms of acceptance, for example, vis-a-vis the different interventions that needed to be introduced. Now that we are mainly talking about a climate crisis, maybe how can we manage all this? So because there are people who actually state that what the state is doing is not enough. So maybe this has to do with the legitimacy side of things. So actually, I believe this is something that we have observed over time. So with the new coronavirus, with the zero coronavirus initiative, we saw that this is part of something that was connected to the civil society. So when we observe, as we said, democracies, their basis is actually connected to a number of pluralistic decisions. And this has to do with the legitimization of the whole institution. So for those who think that this is not enough, that this is too much, they have a right to express themselves. They have a right to come up with groups and to try and bring about some sort of change. Therefore, a minority perspective could also be turned into a mainstream perspective, let's say. This is the possibility offered to us by our democracy. So yes, as you said, this was clear to see throughout the pandemic. So maybe that was not as present in the public debate, but maybe we haven't gone far enough. So it was interesting. Anybody else who would like to share their perspectives? So I was just thinking about what you said, the different opinions of the minorities and the majorities, and maybe the different perspectives brought about by the experts from a philosophical viewpoint. How can we go about it, creating a sort of plaidoyer, if you will, and so that we can understand what type of risks would actually come up if we were to follow the minority perspectives. As we said, we didn't have enough knowledge, as you know, at the beginning of the pandemic. But to actually decide what theory we should follow, probably we're better suited now. So, losing out on trust and the erosion of our democracy. So maybe the topic West versus East could be interesting. So a new perspective on the East from a Westerner position. So maybe we should rethink our strategies to actually face with preventative measures extremisms in the East. Who would like to start off? So, personally speaking, I think that this is quite complex and difficult. There are quite a few differences, which is, of course, important. You are right in stating that we should take into account all the different aspects pertaining to a community. So, in terms of research about uncertainties in the different communities, yes, there are a few security cultures, if you will, that need to be further analyzed. So when I actually do that, I come from the region of Schwaben, as you know, and and most conspiracists actually come from my area, and their pool of people who actually believe that the corona crisis did not exist is quite big. And if we talk about the crisis in Ukraine, there are quite a few people who are skeptical. So, in this context, probably I pay a bit more attention to those areas. So, it's important to actually try and understand where this stems from, how we manage this. And in our research sites in Germany, in particular in the western part of Germany, we have established and seen that there were quite a few people who conveyed a more heterogeneous picture, actually, considering the existence of the virus itself. So maybe east, west, north, south. So we could look at it from a regional perspective and try and understand how we can best manage it. So with the different police stations in the area of Tübingen, well, there are still some demonstrations against the pandemic, also against the existence of such pandemic, which is obviously odd in such a societal context. So we shouldn't actually neglect the fact that those people are gathering because they share one opinion about things. So you are right. Maybe we should develop a strategy to face such a situation, because we kind of think and perceive that there is nothing much that we can do. Yeah. So yeah, I would like to further comment on that. So east, west, I wouldn't say that this does not make any sense from a difference viewpoint from the two sides, but maybe we should draw a few comparisons. So, the different social conditions pertaining to the different regions. So, based on my research, I know that areas in which people live can actually draw from different resources, so resiliency bound. So east, west, there are big differences when we take this into account. So we might think about it in terms of different levels on a scale, on a range. So are we talking about different areas or all the way down to different neighborhoods? So we could try to come up with a strategy based on that. So social capital. So what you said just brings me back to this topic that is the focus of your research, social capital radar. What is this radar? So actually, uh, so this is something that would help us out coming up with technical solutions in such contests. So we have projects to actually offer such technical solutions. So this is what we define as social capital radar, which is a tool which is interactive with the RKI. We saw that too when we gauge the different levels of infection caused by the pandemic. So we came up with a survey, for example, supporting this radar. So we developed it especially for the community of Wuppertal. And we also tried and engaged the willingness and the capacity of actually uh, community to display some sort of self-help. So, so throughout a crisis or a catastrophic situation. So we have established some social indicators. So this is a tool so that the decision makers can actually take into account the social structural conditions that do impact the context in which they're active. So this, on the one hand, be utilized for specific events. For example, in our region, we saw that so the resources of professional organization were used to the maximum relatively fast. And then on the other hand, this offers a chance to prioritize the resources at hand over the different regions that are impacted. So I believe that this has to do with a number of organizations. So you can use this tool to actually understand what the impact onto the social context would be. So can I work together with other organizations, for example, so that I can contribute to the social infrastructure? And the basis is actually the basis that we want to come up with, to find some common ground for social resilience and foster it. So the social structural elements that do play a role in establishing to which degree communities are actually resilient. So can other municipalities use that as well? And is this so? Was it designed for it to be used elsewhere as well, to identify which areas need more support? Well, this is a little bit of an issue Of course, this depends on the different municipality modules and specific situations. So there are a few context-related variables. So we can't just say, okay, in every community, in every municipality, this and that will work. So we have also a few follow-up projects through which we analyze quite a few communities. So and we draw comparison between two big ones. So we understood what were the main issues in specific areas, which would then determine an impact onto how actually living together is perceived and how willing people are to help one another out. So this takes into account another further bit of the big picture. So willingness to help. So we can say on the basis of this analysis that such processes are not just in Wuppertal, not present just in Wuppertal, but also elsewhere. So this survey could be put forth further to understand what happens in other municipalities. So we can use that to identify those big frameworks, and there are indicators that probably will come up elsewhere as well. So first of all, we can further develop our radar, and we are planning a sort of guidelines that we can utilize as a red thread, if you will. So, and the draft of different structures that you can use when trying to come up with crisis management systems. So, this is important to conceive that at a community level as well. So in terms of preventative frameworks, if there are no further questions or remarks, I would say that we can now close this session with one last little question mark, if you will. So what can we do, thinking about, for example, the climate crisis? What can we do to be well equipped? So what are the main points that we need to actually prevent crisis? Where do we need to move forward? Where do we need more discussions? Where do we need to proceed further? So that's exactly what I said at the end. So we need a stronger social perspective. This is based on the different needs of individuals, and we have seen that due to the corona crisis. We were all impacted by it in a number of different ways. So this has to do with the different situations that we had to face when we think about resilience strategies. So the creation of those different relationships that we've talked about amongst all the different elements. So yeah, from an individual perspective, I would say that we need to invest more in our resilience schemes. Of course, we cannot conceive this without taking into account the general framework. We are social animals. So, as you said, things might change depending on the specific context. If we are pro-social, for example, if we are a bit more anti-social, but there are humane aspects to be taken into account. So at the end of the day, people decide how to act in a certain specific way, in a certain specific situation. So we need to be able of grasping it. It's a kind of mental revolution, if you will, so that this big change can actually be managed in the best possible way. So maybe we can also change our perspective on crises in the long run. Yes, and at the very end, I would like to focus on communities. And I believe that for the future, flexibility would be the main key point. Flexibility for communities, and also, the pandemic showed us the importance of digitalization to make our life easier. For example, when managing organizations or the collaboration thereof in a sort of network. So I would call this organizational resilience. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you. I hope that you managed to actually get a fresher perspective here and that you can actually bring with you many take-home messages when we talk about this huge topic, which is crisis prevention. So all the interventions are online. The Mannheim Declaration is also available to you online if you want to dive deeper into those topics. I do hope that you have gathered quite a few new ideas and do enjoy the rest of the Congress.